Between 1590 and 1610, more than 600 young girls entered Countess Elizabeth Bathory's castle, and not a single one ever walked back out. She wasn't a witch in the shadows or a crazed peasant, she was one of Hungary's most powerful nobles, and what she believed was the secret to eternal youth was a darkness that threatened to devour everyone around her. The year is 1590, deep in the rugged countryside of the Kingdom of Hungary. Villages dot the land, fragile pockets of life pressed between mountains and forests. For peasants, existence is raw and unforgiving. Families huddle in wooden huts, eating what little bread or boiled cabbage they can scrape together. A single winter frost can kill crops. A bad harvest means hunger. Disease sweeps through homes unchecked. Life expectancy is short, and dreams are smaller still. Then one day, a miracle seems to arrive. A rider comes into the village, his horse well fed and his clothes of fine cloth, standing out like a figure from another world. He carries with him an envelope sealed with thick red wax. The crest imprinted on that wax is unmistakable, the proud symbol of the Bathory family, one of the most powerful dynasties in all of Hungary. Everyone in the village knows that name. The Bathory's dine with kings, command armies, and own vast stretches of land. Their reach is so wide that even peasants, who will never set foot near a noble court, speak of them with reverence and fear. The rider gathers the people together and reads the letter. A girl from the village, perhaps your daughter, perhaps your neighbors, has been selected to serve at Szegety Castle, the home of Countess Elizabeth Bathory herself. At first, silence hangs over the villagers. Then joy breaks out. Mothers cry tears of happiness. Fathers puff up with pride. Neighbors whisper to one another in awe. To serve in a noblewoman's household is an honor beyond imagination. It means the girl will no longer live a life of backbreaking farm work and endless hunger. She will eat well, dress well, and learn to behave like the aristocracy. The letter even promises that she will be taught to read and write, a skill denied to nearly every peasant. Most intoxicating of all, there is the suggestion, faint but powerful, that she might one day marry into wealth. The family packs her few belongings, a patched dress, a scarf handed down from her grandmother, maybe a small wooden cross for protection. Her mother presses a kiss on her forehead and whispers blessings. Her father, standing tall, tells the neighbors that his daughter's future is brighter than anything he could have dreamed. And so, with tears of joy and trembling hands, they send her off. As the girl approaches the towering stone gates of Szegety Castle, she feels as if she has stepped into a fairy tale. The castle rises above her, majestic and imposing, its towers scraping the sky. Servants in clean, well-kept clothing welcome her warmly. She is shown to a soft bed, fed proper meals, and given lessons in manners and etiquette. For weeks, maybe months, she believes she is living a miracle. But beneath the polished halls and noble dining chambers lies another world entirely. In the dungeons below, silver basins are carefully arranged, waiting for use. Torture devices, crafted by skilled hands, stand ready. And the Countess herself walks among her new servants, her gaze lingering just a little too long. She studies their faces, touches their skin, and makes silent judgments about their worth. What no one realizes, not the girls, not their proud parents, not the neighbors envious of their fortune, is that the invitation to serve the Countess is not a blessing. It is a death sentence. Before we step into the halls of this cursed castle, where whispers of vanished girls and a noblewoman's dark obsessions still linger, take a moment to subscribe and tap that like button. If you're drawn to history's darker corners, to the secrets too chilling for the textbooks, then you're exactly where you should be. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Elizabeth Bathory does not see daughters with bright futures. She does not see innocence, or hope, or the love of the families who sent them. She sees a resource. She sees ingredients. She sees the lifeblood she believes will keep her young forever. It is in this way that over 600 young girls vanish behind those castle walls. each of them stepping through the gates with hope in their hearts, each of them destined never to leave again. Their families, at first, wait for letters that never come. When weeks pass, they tell themselves their daughters must be busy with duties, too important now to write home. Months stretch into years, and still no word. By then, hope has turned into silence, silence into grief, and grief into acceptance. To outsiders, it seems like a noblewoman has simply been generous, lifting girls from poverty and setting them on paths too lofty for their humble origins. No one dares to question why none of those girls ever return. The truth hides in plain sight. And the truth is this: Countess Elizabeth Bathory, one of Hungary's most powerful nobles, is quietly constructing a system of deception so clever, so effective, that it convinces families to willingly hand over their daughters to her castle, daughters who will never again walk free. Elizabeth Bathory's reign of terror did not begin in her castle. It began long before she ever lured her first victim through those iron gates. To understand the monster she became, you have to step back into her childhood, into a world where power, cruelty, and blood were part of her inheritance. Elizabeth was born in 1560, into the most powerful noble family in Hungary. The Bathory dynasty controlled vast lands, commanded armies, and married into royalty. Their influence stretched so wide that their family crest was as familiar as a royal seal. But beneath the grandeur of their titles and riches lay something far more dangerous: a poisoned bloodline. For centuries, the Bathorys had practiced inbreeding, cousins marrying cousins, in an attempt to keep their power consolidated within the family. On paper, it looked like strategy. In reality, it was a genetic curse. Madness, cruelty, and instability seeped through their veins, passed from one generation to the next. Elizabeth's relatives were living proof of the curse. Her uncle, a decorated war general, was praised as a brilliant strategist, but privately he was infamous for torturing prisoners for entertainment. Her brother flew into uncontrollable rages, fits so violent it sometimes took several servants to restrain him. Her sister Clara lived tormented by voices no one else could hear. But Elizabeth seemed different. From the outside, she was beautiful, intelligent, even refined. She spoke several languages, could play musical instruments, and displayed a sharp wit that impressed tutors and courtiers alike. She looked like the exception, the golden child born from a tainted line. What no one realized was that she carried the worst traits of all: the intelligence to plan, the charm to manipulate, and the absence of empathy to carry out unspeakable acts. Her childhood was not one of innocence. When peasant rebellions broke out against her family's harsh rule, Elizabeth watched as soldiers carried out punishments designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. In one infamous case, rebels were sewn alive into the bellies of dying horses, left to writhe until both man and animal perished together. Most children would be scarred by witnessing such brutality. Elizabeth was not horrified. She was fascinated. This was the world that shaped her, one where human suffering was a tool of power, and where noble blood meant you were untouchable. At just 15 years old, Elizabeth was married off to Ferenc Nadasdy, a ruthless soldier nicknamed the Black Knight of Hungary. It was not a love match. It was a union of power, two great families binding themselves together to tighten their grip on the kingdom. Elizabeth moved to Szegety Castle, the fortress that would later become infamous for her crimes. Perched high on a mountain, its walls were thick, its halls endless, and its isolation complete. Ferenc was often away leading battles, leaving Elizabeth alone in a castle with hundreds of empty rooms and only her servants for company. It was here that something began to shift. Court records from the time mentioned servant girls disappearing, written off as accidents or runaways. But we now know better. These were Elizabeth's first experiments, tentative steps into cruelty that would one day become her obsession. The seeds of her madness had been planted in childhood. At Szegety, they began to bloom. Okay, stay with me now. This is the part of the story where everything sharpens, where the line between noble woman and monster vanishes. Historians argue over the exact moment, but legend speaks of a single, chilling incident. One day, Elizabeth struck a maid in anger, some say for spilling wine, others for moving too slowly. The blow drew blood, splattering across Elizabeth's skin. Later, gazing into her mirror, she believed she saw something miraculous. Where the maid's blood had touched her face, her skin looked smoother, more youthful, almost glowing. To any other person, it would have been nothing. To Elizabeth, it was revelation. In her fractured mind, blood was not just life, it was the fountain of youth. From that moment, the experiments became deliberate. She cut servants to collect their blood in silver basins. She smeared it across her face, convinced she could see the years peeling away. Each time, she told herself she looked younger, more beautiful. Each time, the delusion grew stronger. Elizabeth was no longer just a cruel noblewoman. She had found a purpose for her cruelty. And cruelty with purpose is far more dangerous than cruelty for pleasure. Her husband's death in 1604 removed the last restraint on her. Ferenc, brutal as he was, had at least provided the appearance of oversight. With him gone, Elizabeth was free. Free to pursue her research. Free to escalate. She recruited accomplices, trusted servants who either shared her belief or were too terrified to refuse. Together, they perfected methods of torture and blood collection. They studied which ages produced the best blood, experimented with keeping victims alive longer, and built a system that turned murder into ritual. But what made Elizabeth unique among killers was not just the brutality, it was her genius for deception. Rather than dragging victims from roadsides or dark alleys, she created a system that made families deliver their daughters willingly. Official letters went out to villages, promising education, refinement, and noble opportunities. Families, desperate to escape poverty, competed to send their daughters to serve the countess. Girls arrived at the castle smiling, dressed in their finest rags, believing they had been chosen for greatness. They did not know they had been chosen for death. For nearly 20 years, this system operated in silence. Hundreds of girls vanished into Sedgetay Castle, each believing they were stepping into a fairy tale. Each walked willingly into Elizabeth's trap. But as with all monsters, hunger grows. What began with peasants would not end there. Elizabeth soon convinced herself that peasant blood was weak. To truly reverse time, she believed she needed the blood of nobility, blood refined by centuries of privilege, education, and wealth. And in pursuing that, she would make the fatal mistake that exposed everything. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth Bathory perfected her dark system. Villagers across Hungary whispered with pride when one of their daughters was chosen to serve at Sedgetay Castle. Mothers packed belongings with trembling hands, fathers walked with their heads held high, and girls went willingly through the castle gates. And once inside, Elizabeth's trap snapped shut. By the early 1600s, hundreds of young women had vanished without a trace. The deception worked because the victims were peasants, powerless families too poor or too fearful to question a noblewoman. When their daughters never returned, they accepted the silence as part of fate. Some believed their children had been placed in distant households. Others clung to the hope that they were serving nobility in ways beyond their reach. But Elizabeth's hunger was growing. In her warped mind, blood was not all equal. She began to believe in a hierarchy. Peasant blood could only slow aging, but noble blood could reverse it. She became obsessed with the idea that girls raised in comfort and privilege carried purer lifeblood, a concentrated essence of beauty and refinement. And so, she turned her gaze toward the daughters of the aristocracy. Elizabeth crafted her next scheme with the same brilliance that had made her deceptions so effective. She announced the creation of an academy for noble refinement, a finishing school where daughters of the minor nobility could learn languages, music, etiquette, and all the arts of courtly life. The invitations were works of art themselves, fine paper sealed with gold wax, delivered by servants in ornate livery. The promises were irresistible. Who would not want their daughter personally educated by Countess Elizabeth Bathory, one of the most prestigious women in Hungary? Noble families who had once looked down on her peasant recruitment now sent their daughters eagerly. But here was Elizabeth's fatal mistake. Unlike peasants, noble families expected letters, visits, and reports. They had influence, connections, and the means to ask questions if their daughters failed to return. Elizabeth, blinded by obsession, treated noble daughters exactly as she had peasants, as ingredients. And when the first girl failed to come home, whispers began to spread. The first major crack came in 1609. A Croatian nobleman sent his daughter, Sejana, to Elizabeth's academy. When she failed to return home for Christmas, her father demanded answers. Elizabeth responded with arrogance, claiming the girl had been placed in a Viennese household where discretion forbade contact. But this was no peasant father. Sejana's family had ties to the Habsburg court. They were not so easily silenced. Other nobles began comparing notes. Families realized that their daughters, too, had vanished without word or explanation. Letters were exchanged, rumors swirled, and soon a network of concerned aristocrats was forming. The most powerful families in Hungary began to suspect that something unspeakable was happening behind the walls of Szeged Castle. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's obsession only deepened. Servants testified that she became skeletal thin, refusing to eat ordinary food. Instead, she concocted elixirs from organs and blood mixed with wine and herbs. Her mirror rituals grew longer, more elaborate. She measured her face with calipers, recording every supposed improvement in leather-bound journals. And all the while, noble families were preparing to act. The complaints reached the ears of Palatine George Thurzo, one of the most powerful men in Hungary and the representative of King Matthias II himself. He faced a dangerous dilemma. Elizabeth was not just any woman, she was one of the most powerful nobles in the land, shielded by wealth and bloodline. But the accusations could not be ignored. If Elizabeth had truly murdered noble daughters, the stability of the Hungarian aristocracy was at risk. Thurzo began gathering intelligence. He listened to witnesses, examined the testimonies of servants, and compiled evidence. The storm was gathering, and Elizabeth, lost in her mirrors and delusions, never saw it coming. For 20 years, she had hidden her crimes in plain sight. But now, her arrogance has betrayed her. The year was 1610, and the storm that had been building for months finally broke. Complaints from noble families had reached the Hungarian court, and the evidence against Countess Elizabeth Bathory was too strong to ignore. Palatine George Thurzo, the king's most trusted representative, had a choice: either confront one of the most powerful women in Europe or allow the kingdom's nobility to collapse under scandal and fear. Thurzo chose confrontation. In late December, he gathered a force of soldiers, priests, legal clerks, and even court artists. This would not be a simple arrest. It would be a military operation, timed and planned with precision. Thurzo knew that if Elizabeth discovered their approach, she could destroy evidence or even mount a defense with her loyal retainers. So he struck on a night when she least expected it. On December 30th, 1610, under cover of darkness, the company climbed the winding mountain path towards Szeged Castle. The wind carried with it an unnatural stench, one villagers had whispered about for months. Livestock avoided the area. Travelers spoke of a heaviness in the air, as if the very stones remembered suffering. Even hardened soldiers felt unease. One later wrote to his family that the walls seemed to breathe sorrow, and the ground trembled with secrets. The company reached the castle gates, their torches flickering against the stone. Thurzo raised his hand, and the doors were forced open. Inside, they found Elizabeth Bathory hosting a small gathering with her closest accomplices. Her demeanor was imperious, confident, as though she were greeting honored guests. She demanded to know why the Palatine had entered her home unannounced. When Thurzo presented the royal warrant, her mask of arrogance faltered for the first time. Her accomplices exchanged nervous glances, realizing that the shield of noble privilege might no longer protect them. The search began. The investigators descended into the lower chambers of Szeged Castle. what they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The dungeons had been transformed into facilities of systematic cruelty. Stone floors were carved with channels that led into silver basins, placed with mathematical precision to collect blood. Iron hooks dangled from ceilings, worn from repeated use. Torture devices, crafted not in haste but by skilled metalworkers, stood ready in chamber after chamber. Each room had its own horrific purpose, one for restraining victims during bloodletting, another for warming blood before use, a third for Elizabeth's so-called beauty laboratory. On wooden tables, the investigators found surgical knives, preserved organs in glass jars, and mirrors positioned at every angle. Parchment journals filled with sketches, measurements, and notes on the quality of different blood types littered the room. Elizabeth had not seen herself as a killer. She had seen herself as a scientist, documenting what she believed were experiments in eternal youth. The soldiers also found bodies. Some hung from the hooks, lifeless and pale. Others lay discarded, bearing the marks of prolonged torture. In one chamber, a girl still clung to life, whispering prayers with lips too weak to form words. The priests rushed forward to deliver last rites as soldiers turned away in horror. It was no longer a rumor. It was evidence carved into stone and flesh. As the investigators catalogued the evidence, Elizabeth herself remained eerily calm. When confronted with the horrors in her dungeon, she did not collapse in guilt or rage. Instead, she spoke with chilling conviction. "These girls should be honored," she told Thurzo. "Their blood serves a purpose greater than their meaningless lives ever could." To her, the hundreds of lives she had consumed were not tragedies, they were sacrifices to a twisted vision of beauty and immortality. The clerks documented everything in precise legal Latin. The priests prayed louder. The artists sketched the layout of the chambers, the tools of torture, and the faces of the victims. This would become one of the most detailed criminal reports of the medieval era, preserved in archives for centuries. By the time the soldiers finished their search, the truth was undeniable. The woman who had once dined with kings and commanded armies was not merely eccentric or cruel. She was the architect of one of history's most systematic killing sprees. Elizabeth was placed under house arrest that very night. Her accomplices, Dorothea, Ilona, Carter, and Janos, were dragged away in chains. Their faces betrayed terror, knowing that their mistress could no longer protect them. For the villagers watching from afar, the sight was surreal. The countess, who had been untouchable for decades, was being escorted like a common criminal. For the first time, whispers of hope spread through the countryside. Perhaps justice had finally come for the daughters who never returned. But Elizabeth herself never admitted guilt. As she was confined to her chambers, she repeated the same justification to anyone who would listen, that she was preserving her beauty for the glory of Hungary, and that those who questioned her were too ignorant to understand her greatness. Her delusion was unshaken, even as the world around her crumbled. The raid of December 1610 was more than the arrest of a murderer. It was the unmasking of a legend. For 20 years, Elizabeth Bathory had operated in the open, protected by her status, feared by her subjects, and fed by the desperation of families who believed her lies. That night, the curtain was pulled back, revealing not a countess of grace and refinement, but a woman who had built a workshop of hell beneath her own home. And though her castle would remain standing for centuries, its stones would never again be looked at the same way. For those who walked its halls that night, every wall, every shadow, carried the memory of screams that had once echoed there. Elizabeth Bathory was no longer the hostess of noble banquets. She was the prisoner of her own crimes. The raid on Sejte Castle in December 1610 had stripped Elizabeth Bathory of her illusions of power. For 2 decades she had ruled her fortress like a queen, but now she was reduced to a prisoner in her own halls. Soldiers patrolled her corridors. Priests blessed the rooms she had turned into chambers of horror, and scribes carefully carried away the journals where she had catalogued her crimes like experiments. But the arrest was only the beginning. Hungary's nobility demanded answers, and Europe itself buzzed with rumors. Was it true? Had one of the wealthiest, most respected women in the kingdom really murdered hundreds of girls in search of eternal youth? Or was it all a political conspiracy to destroy her? The Hungarian court needed to show the world that justice would be served. The first to face trial were Elizabeth's accomplices. Dorothea, Ilona, Kata, and Janos had served her faithfully, luring girls into the castle, restraining them in the chambers below, and carrying out the Countess's gruesome orders. Now, with Elizabeth shielded from direct trial by her noble status, the weight of blame fell squarely on them. The trial took place in the town of Baita, drawing crowds from across the region. For many families, this was the first chance to hear what had really happened to their missing daughters. Witnesses came forward, villagers, priests, even former servants of the castle. Each testimony was darker than the last. One villager spoke of seeing carts leaving the castle under cover of night, piled high with what looked like sacks but carried the unmistakable smell of decay. A servant confessed that she had been ordered to scrub blood from the stones of the dungeon walls. A local priest revealed that he had been approached by families begging him to investigate their daughters' disappearances, only to admit he had been powerless to question a woman of Elizabeth's rank. And then came the testimonies of the accomplices themselves. Under oath, and, in some cases, under torture, they described in chilling detail how Elizabeth demanded blood to bathe in, how she tested which ages produced the best results, and how she grew more obsessed with every passing year. The court was horrified. This was not the impulsive cruelty of a madwoman. This was systematic murder, carried out with precision and purpose. The sentences reflected the fury of a society that had finally seen the monster hiding behind noble privilege. Dorothea and Ilona were condemned to a gruesome fate, their fingers torn off with red-hot pincers before being burned alive. Kata, the youngest, claimed she had acted under fear and coercion. She was spared execution but sentenced to life imprisonment. Janos, broken by the weight of his confessions, died in custody before the trial concluded. The accomplices were destroyed. But what of Elizabeth herself? Elizabeth Bathory could not be tried in an ordinary court. Her blood, the very thing she believed gave her superiority, also gave her protection. To publicly execute a countess of her stature would shake the foundations of Hungary's nobility. But to let her go free would be unthinkable. The compromise was unprecedented. Elizabeth would not face the executioner. Instead, she would be imprisoned for life within her own castle walls. Masons were summoned to Szeged Castle. They sealed off a chamber entirely with stone, leaving only two small slits, one for food and one for air. No windows, no doors, no visitors. Elizabeth Bathory, who had once commanded banquets in grand halls and measured her beauty in mirrors surrounded by candlelight, was entombed in darkness. Her new home was a stone cell where the only voices she could hear were her own. For the first months, guards reported hearing her ranting, sometimes shouting about conspiracies, other times singing fragments of songs from her youth. Occasionally, her voice would shift to pleading, begging for release, insisting she had done nothing wrong. But as the months turned into years, her voice grew weaker, her words less frequent, until eventually there was silence. The woman who had once craved eternal youth had aged alone, unseen, in her own tomb. On August 21, 1614, guards delivering her food found no movement. For several days, her meals had gone untouched. When they broke through the stone, they discovered Elizabeth's lifeless body. She was 54 years old. There was no grand funeral, no public mourning. Even her own family distanced themselves from her memory. Her name was struck from genealogies, her legacy denied. She was buried quietly, without ceremony, as though her relatives believed that erasing her would erase the stain she had left on the family. But if Elizabeth thought she would achieve immortality through the blood of innocence, she had been wrong. Her immortality came in another form. She became a legend. Elizabeth Bathory's crimes echoed across Europe. Whispers of a countess who bathed in blood spread quickly, inspiring vampire legends and horror tales for centuries. To this day, she is remembered as the Blood Countess, the woman who lured more than 600 young girls to their deaths. Her story is not just one of cruelty, but of power unchecked, how nobility and privilege allowed her to hide her crimes for decades, how fear silenced villages, and how obsession can twist intelligence into evil. The castle still stands, its stones silent witnesses to the suffering that once echoed within. Tourists who visit swear the halls are colder than the air outside, as if the walls themselves remember. Elizabeth wanted to be remembered as eternally young, eternally beautiful. Instead, she became eternal as a warning. But hers is not the only tale of power curdled into madness, nor the only palace where whispers still cling to the stones. Because while Elizabeth's legend was born in Hungary, elsewhere in Europe another ruler's obsession would unleash horrors of its own. Check that video on the screen now.